The house was too quiet. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped through the front door, folder in hand, keys still swinging from my fingers. Marcus's car sat in the driveway, though he wasn't supposed to be home. He was supposed to be at the church office, finishing the budget report for Sunday's meeting. I'd told myself I'd only be a minute, grab the folder, get back to the car, make it to my own meeting on time. But the silence stopped me in the hallway. Not the ordinary silence of an empty house, a held silence. The kind a room makes when it's trying not to be heard. Then, faint from somewhere beneath my feet, a sound, a voice. Iris's voice, though I almost didn't recognize it, thin and pleading in a way I'd never heard my daughter sound before. My hand found the basement door. I don't remember deciding to reach for it. The stairs creaked under my weight one at a time, and with each step the sound from below sharpened. A man's voice now too, low, urgent, telling someone to be still, to be quiet, that it would be over soon. I reached the bottom step. I saw my daughter. I saw my husband. And in that instant, 27 years of marriage folded in on themselves like a photograph catching fire from the edges inward. They asked me later, sitting across a metal table with my hands cuffed in my lap, whether I regretted what I did. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, because there was a better question underneath theirs, one I'd been asking myself for months before that night, long before there was ever a fire, long before there were ever handcuffs. How does a woman live in a house for 27 years and never see what's happening 3 feet beneath her kitchen floor? I still don't fully know the answer. I know the pieces of it. I know the shape of my own blindness now, the way you know the shape of a bruise days after you stopped feeling the impact. They expected me to cry in that room. I could see it in the way the officer kept glancing at the tissue box on the table, angling it toward me like an offering. I didn't cry. I sat there, calm in a way that seemed to unsettle them more than tears would have. Because I wasn't broken the way they meant. I'd already done my breaking months earlier in pieces in a house that looked perfect from the street. To understand what I did, you have to understand who we were before it. You have to understand the woman I used to be and the man I thought I'd married. If stories like this one stay with you, the kind that sit behind an ordinary front door until they don't, this channel is where they live. We tell the stories of women who stopped staying quiet and what it cost them to finally speak. Subscribe now, because what happened in that basement is only where this story begins. I was 55 years old, married to a man everyone in our church called a pillar. Marcus had been a deacon for 11 years. He organized the men's ministry, drove the elderly to their appointments, and never missed a Sunday, rain or otherwise. People used to tell me unprompted how lucky I was. I used to agree with them. We'd built a life that looked, from every angle I could see, solid. A 4-bedroom house we'd paid off 6 years early. A daughter, Iris, 21 in her junior year at State, studying to become a nurse. A marriage that had survived the things most marriages don't. A stillbirth and our 3rd year together, his father's long decline, my own bout with cancer that we'd walked through side by side, him sleeping in a chair beside my hospital bed for 11 nights straight. I want to be honest about something. I was not a foolish woman. I noticed things. I asked questions. I have spent every day since that basement combing back through the last several years of my life, and what I've found isn't a portrait of a woman who refused to see. It's a portrait of a woman who saw pieces and built a story around them that let her keep loving the man she'd chosen. That's not stupidity. I've had to learn the difference. It's just harder to admit. Iris used to tell me everything. As a little girl, she'd narrate her entire day to me at dinner, unprompted, down to what her friend Keisha said at recess. That closeness didn't disappear overnight. It eroded, slowly enough that I mistook it for a long time for the ordinary distance that comes with growing up. I remember thinking the last spring before everything that I had a good life. I remember being proud of it. I didn't know yet how much of that pride was built on a floor I hadn't checked for cracks. The first time I really noticed something, Iris was home for a long weekend in early spring. She came in Friday evening, dropped her bag by the stairs, and hugged me the way she always did, quick, tight, her chin on my shoulder for half a second longer than necessary, the way she'd done since she was small. But when Marcus walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, still in work clothes, asking how the drive down had been, I watched my daughter's shoulders come up around her ears like a girl bracing for cold water. Good. Traffic wasn't bad. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the refrigerator, at a spot just past his shoulder, and reached for a glass of water she didn't drink. I told myself it was nothing. College does something to kids, pulls them a little sideways from the people who raised them. I'd read that in a magazine once, or heard it from another mother at church. It fit neatly into a shape I already understood, so I let it stay there. That night, though, I woke up around 11 to the sound of Iris's voice, low on the phone in the guest room down the hall. I wasn't trying to listen. I was on my way to the bathroom, but I caught 4 words through the door before I made myself keep walking. I can't tell her. I stood in the hallway a long moment after that, my hand flat against the wall, not sure what I'd just heard the edges of. I told myself it was about a boy, a grade, a friend's business that wasn't mine to know. I went back to bed. I didn't ask her about it in the morning. She left Sunday afternoon with the same quick hug, and I watched her car pull out of the driveway and told myself again that it was nothing. 3 weeks later, she called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight in a way that made me set down the dish towel and give her my full attention. "Mom, there's something I need to..." And then nothing. A pause with a shape to it, like she was listening to something on her end. "Iris? Sorry, it's nothing. Dad's home. I hear his truck. I gotta go. I have a paper due." She hung up before I could say goodbye. I stood in my kitchen holding a phone that had already gone quiet, turning her sentence over. "There's something I need to..." Need to what? Tell me? Ask me? Confess? I called her back twice that night. Both times it went to voicemail. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later from Iris herself and from a young woman named Dana, who I'd never met but would come to owe more than I can say, was that 3 states away, in a cramped dorm room that smelled like burnt popcorn and cheap candles, my daughter was sitting on her roommate's bed with her knees pulled to her chest, telling her best friend the beginning of a sentence she couldn't finish with me. "Something's wrong at home," is as far as Iris got, according to what Dana told the investigators much later. Something with my dad. Dana had pushed, gently, the way you push someone you love when you can see they're carrying something too heavy to name. "What do you mean, something with your dad?" Iris hadn't answered that either. She'd cried instead, the kind of crying that isn't really about anything you can point to, and Dana had held her and let it be enough for that night, just to not be alone with it. "You have to tell your mom," Dana said. "I can't," said Iris. "He told me what would happen if I did." Dana didn't know what that meant either. Neither did I. We were both in our own separate rooms, holding half of something too dangerous to look at whole. I confronted a version of my suspicion exactly once before everything, and I want to tell you honestly what I did with it because I think it matters. It was a Sunday after church, Iris home for the weekend again, and I found her alone in the laundry room, just the two of us, folding towels in a silence that had started to feel less like peace and more like something held. "Baby, is everything okay? With you and your dad?" She stopped folding. Her hands went still over a blue towel, and for 3 full seconds, I counted them later in memory the way you count things you wish you'd counted differently, she looked like she was standing at the edge of something. "Iris?" "We're fine, Mom." Her voice came out too fast, too bright, like a light switched on in a dark room. "Why would you ask that? You've just seemed—" The basement door at the end of the hall opened, Marcus's footsteps on the stairs. Iris's whole face changed before he'd even come into view, like a curtain drawn fast over a window. "I'm fine," she said again, quieter now, already turning back to the towels. Marcus appeared in the doorway smiling, asking if we wanted to order pizza for dinner, and just like that, the moment closed over itself like water. I let it close. I told myself I'd try again later when we had more privacy, more time. I didn't yet understand that later was a door Marcus had learned over years exactly how to shut. I want to slow down here because this is the part of the story people find hardest to forgive me for, and it's the part I've had to spend the most time forgiving myself for, too. I had pieces, a phone call cut short, a sentence that stopped at "I need to," a daughter who flinched at footsteps, a closed laundry room door that felt somehow like the wrong kind of quiet. None of those pieces alone spelled out what was actually happening under my own roof, and the full shape they made together was one I did not want to see because seeing it meant accepting that the man who'd held my hand through chemotherapy, who'd built a swing set in our backyard the week Iris turned 4, who stood up every Sunday and spoke about integrity like it was something he'd invented, that man was capable of something I didn't have a word ugly enough for. So I didn't see it. Not fully. Not yet. I want you to sit with that because I think it's the truest thing I can tell you about how something like this survives inside a family for as long as it does. It doesn't survive because the people around it are careless. It survives because the alternative to not seeing is sometimes a grief so large that a person's mind builds walls around it without being asked. I was building walls. I didn't know it yet, but I was. It was around this time that a strange thing started happening to my memory. Small moments from years earlier began surfacing, uninvited, at odd hours, while I was driving, while I was cooking, while I was half asleep. I remembered Iris at 16, refusing, out of nowhere, to keep doing her homework at the kitchen table on weeknights when Marcus worked late shifts, insisting instead on doing it at the library until closing. I thought it was a phase, teenagers wanting independence. I remembered a lock Marcus had installed on the basement door 3 years earlier, for the tools, he'd said, in case anyone wanders down there and hurts themselves. Though we didn't own power tools worth locking up, and no one had ever wandered anywhere near that basement before the lock went in. I remembered Iris, home from her first semester from state, choosing to spend an unusual amount of that first Christmas break at her aunt's house 40 minutes away, citing a project, a study group, a friend's family gathering, reasons that each had seemed at the time entirely reasonable, and that now, lined up end to end, looked like a girl finding every excuse available to not be under our roof. None of these memories alone proved anything. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound cleaner than it was, to say I connected every dot and simply refused to act. That isn't what happened. What happened is that my mind kept handing me these fragments, and I kept trying to fit each one into an explanation that didn't require the unthinkable. And each time the fit got a little worse, and I got a little more tired from the effort of forcing it. I didn't know on any given day that I was circling the truth. Only I knew something in my chest had started to feel permanently unsettled, like a picture hung slightly crooked that I couldn't stop noticing every time I walked past it. Then came the Tuesday that ended the not knowing for good. I'd left for a 9 a.m. planning meeting at the community center, 20 minutes from home, and made it as far as the parking lot before realizing I'd left the folder with the budget projections sitting on my kitchen counter. Marcus's schedule had him at the church office until at least noon. He'd mentioned it at breakfast, some issue with the Sunday printouts. Iris was supposed to be back at school. She'd left the night before, so I believed. I turned the car around. Marcus's truck was in the driveway when I pulled in. I remember the small, dumb relief I felt. Oh, good, he can grab the folder for me, before the quiet of the house registered as wrong instead of ordinary. I called his name. Nothing. I walked toward the kitchen, and that's when I heard it, muffled, coming from beneath the floor, my daughter's voice, breaking in a way I had never once heard in 21 years of knowing her. I don't remember deciding to go to the basement door. I remember my hand already on it. I remember it wasn't locked, though the key had always lived on Marcus's ring, though he was the only one who ever went down there anymore. I remember the stairs. I remember reaching the bottom and the single unbearable second in which my eyes tried to make the scene in front of me mean something else, anything else, before they couldn't anymore. I am not going to describe what I saw down there in detail, and I want to explain why, because I think it matters. What happened to my daughter in that basement was not a spectacle. It was not a twist designed to shock you. It was the private terror of a young woman who had been made to believe over years that speaking would cost her everything. She doesn't owe the world the specifics of her own violation for her pain to be believed. What I will tell you is what I felt. The floor tilting beneath feet that weren't moving, a ringing that swallowed every other sound, and a single complete understanding arriving all at once the way a held breath finally leaves a body, that every fragment I'd spent months explaining away had been true the entire time. Marcus turned and saw me standing in the doorway. I don't know what he expected. I know what I gave him, because I remember the sound of my own voice, flat and strange, asking a question I already knew the answer to. How long? It wasn't a question, really. It was an accusation shaped like one. What followed in the hours after is a blur of things said and unsaid, but 3 conversations from that day have stayed with me in perfect, unbearable clarity. And I want to give you all 3 because each one taught me something different about the man I'd married. The first was with Marcus, alone, in the living room, 20 minutes after I'd gotten Iris upstairs and behind a locked door. He didn't deny it, not fully, not at first. He tried something stranger. He tried to make it smaller than it was. He used words like misunderstanding and overreacting, and at one point, the sentence that I think finally killed whatever remained of the marriage in my chest. You're going to destroy this family over something you didn't even really see clearly. I had seen it clearly enough. When minimizing didn't work, he tried something else. He reached for my hand. I let him, for one confused second out of 27 years of habit, and he talked about our wedding day, about the 11 nights he'd slept in a chair beside my hospital bed, about the swing set, about his position at church, about what people would say, about what this would do to us. Not once in that entire conversation did he ask how Iris was. I noticed that. I want you to notice it too, because it's the moment I understood something crucial about the man across from me. His panic wasn't about what he'd done to his daughter. It was about what would happen to him now that I knew. The second conversation later that evening was with Iris. I sat on the edge of her bed while she told me in fragments, with long silences between them that I made myself not fill, how long it had been going on and why she had never told me. I'm not going to walk you through every detail of what she said. Some of what happened in our house belongs only to her, and I've come to believe that a mother's job, even in telling this story, is to protect what's left of her daughter's privacy as fiercely as she failed for a while to protect anything else. But I'll tell you what she told me about the silence, because I think that part is the truest thing I can offer anyone listening to this who might recognize pieces of their own family in it. She told me her father had convinced her, slowly over years, that if she ever said anything, no one would believe her over him, that his standing at church, his reputation, his role in this family would always outweigh her word. He told her it would destroy me. He told her it would destroy our family, our home, everything I'd worked for. He made her carry the responsibility for a silence that was never hers to carry in the first place. Every time I almost told you, she said, staring at her hands, I could hear him saying it, that nobody would believe me, that I'd be the one who ruined everything. I thought about the laundry room, the phone call cut short, the 3 seconds she'd stood at the edge of telling me in a room full of folded towels before a set of footsteps on the basement stairs closed the door on her courage. I hadn't failed to notice the warning signs. I'd noticed nearly all of them. What I hadn't understood was what they were warning me about. The third conversation happened 2 days later, and it was the one that ended any lingering foolish hope I'd been carrying that Marcus might, somewhere underneath it all, feel something like real remorse. He found me in the kitchen and started talking before I'd even turned around, about his position on the deacon board, about what exposure would mean for the church, for his name, for the community we'd spent decades building a life inside of, about how people would look at him, about what he stood to lose. He never once, in that entire conversation, said my daughter's name. I stood there and finally let myself understand something I think I'd been circling for 2 days without landing on it. This man was not afraid of what he'd done. He was afraid of what would happen to him if the world found out what he'd done. Those are not the same fear, and only one of them belongs to a person capable of change. I stopped waiting for an apology after that. I started, instead, to look. 3 days after the basement, while Marcus was at what he claimed was an emergency deacon meeting, I went into his home office and did something I'd never once done in 27 years of marriage. I went looking for what he didn't want me to find. I found a locked drawer in his desk. I found the key taped beneath a filing cabinet, the way people hide things when they've stopped believing anyone is looking. Inside, a second phone, its battery long dead. A handful of receipts from places I didn't recognize dated across several years for gifts I'd never received. And folded at the bottom, a scrap of paper with a name on it that wasn't mine and wasn't Iris's, written in handwriting I recognized instantly as my husband's. I sat on the floor of his office after that for a long time, holding a piece of paper with a stranger's name on it, understanding that whatever had happened in our basement might not be the only thing my husband had spent years hiding. I didn't know yet who that name belonged to. I would find out sooner than I expected, and closer to home than I ever imagined. The following Sunday, I went to church because staying home felt like an admission I wasn't ready to make in public yet. I sat in our usual pew. Marcus sat beside me, greeting people in the aisle with the same warm, practiced ease he always had. An older woman from the missions committee squeezed my hand on the way out and told me, the way she had a dozen times over the years, how blessed I was to have a husband like Marcus, so devoted, so generous, always the first to volunteer when someone needed help moving, or a ride to a doctor's appointment, or a listening ear. I smiled and thanked her because the alternative was screaming in the church parking lot, and I was not yet ready to become the kind of story people whisper about between services. But I understood standing there exactly what I was up against. This was a community that had spent 11 years building a version of my husband that made what I now knew nearly impossible for them to believe. If I said anything, I wouldn't just be accusing a man. I'd be asking dozens of people to tear down a version of him they trusted for over a decade. And dismantling a story that people have invested that much belief in rarely goes quietly. Marcus knew it too. Later that week, in a conversation that started as an apology and curdled fast into something else, he reminded me, almost gently, that people already thought I was emotional, his word, and that no one, absolutely no one, was going to believe this about a man who'd been standing at that pulpit for over a decade. I said nothing back, but I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, he's not wrong about how hard this will be. He's only wrong about what that means I'm going to do. It was in the middle of that same week that I found the earring. Small, gold, unfamiliar, wedged between the cushions of our guest bathroom sofa, the kind of detail I might have dismissed a month earlier as belonging to some forgotten guest. I didn't dismiss it now. I'd stopped being able to dismiss anything. 2 days later, going through a stack of papers on Marcus's desk that I now searched routinely, I found a laminated ID badge from the church's Wednesday outreach committee. The name on it was Danielle Foster. I knew Danielle, not well, but well enough. She sat 2 rows behind us most Sundays, volunteered alongside me on the missions committee, had complimented my potato salad at the summer picnic not 4 months earlier. I sat with that badge in my hands for a long time, and slowly, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, other memories began to resolve into a different picture. A committee meeting Danielle had canceled at the last minute, twice, on evenings I now realized Marcus had also been working late. A text I'd glimpsed once on his phone screen months back that I'd let slide past me because I trusted him too much then to look closer. I called Iris that night because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't performing for me. I didn't tell her about Danielle. I just needed to hear my daughter breathing on the other end of the line, alive and safe in the apartment I had yet secured for her, still 3 days away. I made one decision in the middle of everything else falling apart that I have never once regretted, and it's the decision I want any mother listening to this to hear clearly. I stopped trying to understand my husband, and I started protecting my daughter. I found a small 1-bedroom apartment across town, paid the deposit in cash from an account Marcus didn't know I had, and drove to Iris's dorm myself to help her pack the things that mattered most. She cried in the car on the way there, not from relief, but from fear. Fear of leaving me behind in that house, fear of what her father might do, fear that this new safety was somehow temporary, a door that might close on her the way every other door had. I took her hand at a red light and told her the only thing I was certain of in that entire impossible month. You are not going back there, not ever. I don't care what it costs. I meant it as a promise about her safety. I didn't know yet how literally the word cost was about to apply to me. 2 days after Iris moved into that apartment, I drove back to the house one last time to collect the rest of my own things. Clothes, files, the small cedar box that held my mother's letters. I told myself it would be a quick, businesslike visit, in and out before dark. Marcus's truck was in the driveway again. I almost turned around. I wish, more than almost anything else in this story, that I had. I let myself in quietly and heard voices from the kitchen before I saw them. Marcus's, and a second voice I recognized instantly, low and familiar in a way that turned my stomach. Danielle's coat was draped over the back of a kitchen chair. Her shoes sat by the door, the way a person's shoes sit in a house they've grown comfortable enough in to stop noticing. I stood in that hallway and understood in one long, silent moment something that broke whatever composure I had left. Nothing had stopped. Not the basement, not my discovery, not the fact that his own daughter had fled her home in fear of him. He had simply continued in the same house as though none of it had happened, as though I were a problem he expected to eventually tire itself out. I'm not going to walk you through every thought that moved through me in the minutes that followed, because I've come to understand that some of what happens in a person's mind in a moment like that isn't really thought at all. It's something older and less reasonable, something that arrives all at once and doesn't ask permission. I want to be honest with you about one thing, though, because I think honesty is the only thing I have left to offer at this point in the story. What I did next was not planned. It was not something I'd been building toward for weeks, waiting for the right night. It was a decision made in the white heat of standing in a hallway and realizing that nothing, not exposure, not shame, not his own daughter's fear, was ever going to stop this man except something irreversible. I made that decision. I knew, even as I made it, that it was wrong. I knew there would be a cost. I made it anyway. I left that house before the fire department arrived. I didn't stay to watch. The Merriweather subdivision hadn't seen an emergency response like it in decades. 3 trucks, an ambulance, neighbors standing on their lawns in bathrobes watching a house that had hosted Christmas parties and graduation cookouts for 10 years fold in on itself in a column of orange light. Marcus did not survive the fire. The investigation began, these things do, quietly, methodically, a fire marshal's report, a canvass of the neighborhood, a review of traffic camera footage from a gas station 2 streets over. My car appeared on that footage, time-stamped less than an hour before the first 911 call. 3 days later, 2 detectives came to the apartment where Iris and I were staying. They asked if I'd come down to the station to answer some questions. I didn't lie to them. I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever else I did that night, I did not spend the days afterwards trying to build a story that wasn't true. When they asked me directly whether I was at the house, I told them yes. When they asked what happened, I told them what I could bear to say, and I didn't ask for a lawyer before I said it. Some part of me, I think, had been waiting to be caught since the moment I walked out of that driveway. Which brings us back to where this story began. A metal table, a box of tissues no one used, and a question I didn't answer right away. Do you regret what you did? I sat with that question for a long moment because it deserved more than a reflex. And then I told the detective the only true thing I had. I regret that it came to this. I don't regret that my daughter is finally safe. I want to be clear, telling you this now, that I am not asking you to admire what I did. What I did was a crime. A man died because of a decision I made, and no amount of what he did to our daughter erases that fact or the responsibility that came with it. I've never once since that night pretended otherwise to myself. But I also will not pretend, for the sake of a tidier story, that I don't understand why I did it. Both things are true at once. That's the part people struggle with most, I think, that a person can be genuinely guilty of something and still be telling the truth about why. In the weeks that followed my arrest, something happened that I will be grateful for until the day I die, regardless of what happens to me. My daughter stopped being silent. Eris gave a full statement to investigators about what her father had done to her and for how long, and why she had never told me. Dana, her friend from school, corroborated the timeline, the late-night phone calls, the unfinished confessions, the fear that had kept my daughter quiet for far longer than any child should ever have to carry something like that alone. Investigators, working through what remained of the house and Marcus's office files, found evidence suggesting Eris had not been the only person my husband had hurt. Danielle, when questioned, admitted to an affair she said she hadn't fully understood the shape of until much later, admitted that Marcus had used the same language of reputation and disbelief on her that he'd used on our daughter, just aimed at a different kind of silence. The church that had called him a pillar for 11 years began, slowly and painfully, to reckon with a version of him none of them had ever been permitted to see. Some people believed Eris immediately. Some took longer. A few, I'm told, never fully did. That, too, is part of the truth of stories like this one, that exposure doesn't always arrive with universal belief attached to it. Sometimes it just arrives with enough belief to matter. There's one more thing I want to tell you, because it's the detail that finally made sense of everything else, the way the last piece of a puzzle changes the meaning of the whole picture once it clicks into place. During the investigation, someone finally asked why that basement door had a lock on it in the first place, a lock installed 3 years before any of this came to light, for tools we never owned. I thought about that lock a long time, about the day Marcus installed it, casual, unremarkable, folded into a Saturday afternoon of ordinary chores. I had walked past that lock 1,000 times in 3 years and never once asked myself what it was actually protecting or from whom. It hadn't been protecting anything. It had been containing something. It had been there the entire time, in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question about it. I had walked past the truth in my own hallway for 3 years. I was charged with arson resulting in death. I did not fight the charge. My attorney wanted to build a defense around everything Marcus had done, and the jury did hear it, and I believe it mattered in the length of the sentence I received. But it did not and should not erase what I did. A man is dead because of a decision I made in a hallway on a night I can't take back. I have made my peace with serving time for that. I have not made peace with pretending it didn't need to be served. I want to say this plainly for anyone listening who might be carrying a rage that feels like mine once did. What I did is not a solution. It is not justice. It is what happens when a person runs out of any other door and chooses the wrong one anyway. There were other doors. I know that now, sitting where I'm sitting. I wish, more than I can say, that I had found one of them instead. Eris comes to see me every other Saturday. We sit across from each other with a pane of glass and a phone line between us, and for the first 15 minutes or so, we usually just talk about ordinary things, her nursing rotations, a professor she likes, a dog Dana's family adopted. 2 weeks ago, near the end of our visit, she told me something I've been holding on to since then. She said that for the first time since she was 18 years old, she doesn't flinch anymore. Not from footsteps, not from a phone ringing the wrong hour, not from silence in a house. I'm not scared anymore, Mom. Whatever else happened, that part's true. I didn't try to explain to her everything I felt hearing that. I let myself cry right there in front of the glass for the first time since the night in that basement. I lost my house. I lost 27 years of a marriage I believed was real. I lost my freedom for a good long while yet. But I didn't lose my daughter, and for the first time since that basement, neither did she. I will never get those years back, and I'm not asking you to decide I was right, but I'll leave you with the question I still sit with. When the people meant to protect you become the danger, and the people meant to believe you look the other way, how far is too far to go for someone you love? Tell me in the comments, could you have stayed silent the way my daughter almost did, or would you have broken too? Subscribe for more stories about the secrets families keep and what finally happens when they come out.